Well, we've been looking the last several days at the different exploration efforts and some settlement efforts in the New World undertaken by European nations. We saw that early on, the two nations that predominated exploration were Spain and to some extent Portugal. Now we're going to move further north in Europe and see how those northern European countries attempted to explore and to colonize as well. We're getting to the point soon where we will be ready to have our first test. And so it looks like we have no school on Monday, so Tuesday will be our Chapter 1 test. So make sure you're looking over your notes, go over them day by day as I've advised, and you will be ready. All right, so let's consider the European conflict then that took place in relationship to the exploration of the New World. Okay, this is the world according to the Spanish and Portuguese, but you can see there's a lot of North America that's not yet included in that. So we find that, and then you should have had this from your notes, you should have this filled in, so just check yourself as we go along. The English, the French, and the Dutch were envious of the Spanish wealth from America. They heard about all this gold and silver coming from America, and so they thought, hey, I want some of that. And at the same time, the Spanish king, Philip II, was set on crushing Protestantism in Europe. The Reformation had been going on for a short period of time. It was spreading throughout Europe. A lot of nations or parts of nations were becoming Protestant. Philip II was very highly connected with the Roman Catholic Church, and so he wanted to stamp out Protestantism. And he was using the gold from Mexico and the silver from Peru in order to finance the wars against Protestants. Well, there were some people that decided to do something about all that gold and silver and to relieve the Spanish of the great weight of transporting gold and silver across the Atlantic Ocean by taking it from their ships. And those were Englishmen, and they were called sea dogs. Really, they were what?
Thieves.
Thieves or pirates, yes. We have Talk Like a Pirate Day coming up soon. I think it's September 19th, so you might think about these guys as you are preparing mentally for that day. The first man and most famous of the two sea dogs was Francis Drake. He was joined by John Hawkins in attacking Spanish shipping in the Caribbean and Central America. Now, Drake had a personal vendetta against the Spanish as well, not just to get wealth. It began during a peaceful trading voyage to the New World that he'd undertaken. In 1568, Drake served under his cousin, Admiral Sir John Hawkins, and captained a ship named the Judith. Well, they were forced by a storm into the Spanish port of San Juan de Ulua, about 15 miles from Veracruz, Mexico. Well, they were promised by the Spanish there to have safe conduct to repair their ships. But instead, the Spaniards attacked them without warning. Drake barely escaped with his life and finally reached England 4 months later. Only 100 of the original 400 plus sailors on that expedition ever saw their homes again. Many were sent to Spain and burned alive by the Inquisition, while some ended up as slaves rowing the Spanish galleons. So this was something that greatly influenced Francis Drake as he set out to not only relieve the Spanish of their gold, but enact a little bit of revenge as well. Now, just as a side note, I want to tell you about a little something I found in reading about this time period, and that was the predominance of a spice called allspice. How many of you ever heard of allspice? Have you ever used it? Okay, do you know why it's called that? Well, it's actually the fruit of a shrubby tree that grows naturally in the West Indies and Central America. And so it was not known before explorers went there, and not known in Europe. But it became an important preservative spice imported to Spain. So when they found out that this spice would help keep food from spoiling, it had a very pungent aroma, which seemed to the English traders who brought it from Spain to be a mixture of several various spices, and so they gave it the name allspice, because it smelled like just all of these different spices together. Now, another interesting thing about allspice is that in the 17th century, pirates put allspice on meat. They're out there at sea a lot, raiding ships, and so they use allspice on their meat, especially to preserve it for the long voyages that they had. And the use of allspice in that way was done according to a French process. The French came up with it, and they called this process boucan, B-O-U-C-A-N. And so the pirates, since they used this, came to be called buccaneers, or buccaneers. So that's where that name comes from. Go Bucks. All right, so the English were not officially at war with Spain, but the English sea dogs continued to prey on Spanish treasure ships. They raided coastal towns, made themselves a much feared enemy of Spain with the tacit and sometimes overt approval of their queen. It was kind of a wink, wink, nod, nod thing. Oh, I don't know what they're doing. Keep doing it. From 1570 to 1573, Francis Drake cruised what was called the Spanish Main, the Caribbean, raiding and plundering. Now, if he had been caught, the Protestant English sailors on his ships would have been subjected to the Spanish Inquisition that was going on. They would have been tortured and then cruelly executed, not as pirates, but as heretics. Although wounded in battle, Drake somehow always eluded their grasp. Drake conducted worship services on board his ship. He had the public reading of Fox's Book of Martyrs, a book I highly recommend to you to read about those that have followed the Christian faith and what happened to them, and prayer. And he readily acknowledged his allegiance to Christ. His hatred of the Catholic Church was not extended to his Spanish prisoners, whom he treated with respect. The treasure fleets that were going from the Caribbean to Spain funded Philip II's persecution and murder of Protestants, and Drake saw his depredation as being a pirate as really doing the Lord's work in handicapping Spain's aggression. Well, on one occasion, Drake found himself in a position where he okay, we need to do this first. In 1577, Francis Drake set sail with 5 ships to discover the fabled Northwest Passage. You've heard of the Northwest Passage? Everybody was trying to find a way through America in order to get to the Pacific Ocean. They thought there must be some waterway that they can go through. That's called the Northwest Passage. And so he was looking for this under orders from Queen Elizabeth. He had 5 ships, and the mission was top secret. Even the crew did not know their final destination, because Spanish spies were everywhere at the court of Elizabeth, and secrecy was absolutely essential. The mission's main goal was to sail into the Pacific and find the western entrance to the passage. So he's sailing all the way around South America up into the Pacific, and he's going to look for the passage from that end, because they couldn't find it from the Atlantic side. And then England would set up a colony there and to accomplish 4 main objectives. Here are the objectives that Drake was given by Queen Elizabeth. First of all, preach the gospel of Christ to all the New World natives. Number 1 goal, preach the gospel. Secondly, he was to arm the New World natives against the Spanish Inquisition. They needed to be able to protect themselves in case the Spanish came along. because if these natives became Christians, if they became Protestants and the Spanish came, they might just kill them because they're Protestants. Thirdly, Drake was told to expel the cruel, rapacious Spaniards from the New World completely. If that indeed was possible, which it probably wasn't, but try to drive out the Spanish. And then fourthly, having gone over to the Pacific Ocean, try to establish trade with the Far East and make England the center of the spice trade. So rather lofty goals for Drake, and secret, known only to him, having been given them by Queen Elizabeth. All right, so interesting that that is the mission upon which Drake was sent by Queen Elizabeth. Any comments or questions? As you're writing these, abbreviate, don't try to write every word, so that we can move on. Now, when John Cabot had sailed for England in 1498, he had had one of those goals, and that was to try to establish trade with the Far East, the Orient. Of course, he did not, but he did establish a colony in Newfoundland area. But that colony was wiped out by the Portuguese and the Spanish, and that's why there was so much secrecy involved in Drake's mission. He left England in September 1577 with 5 ships and 164 men. After many tribulations, he finally arrived in the Pacific Ocean, traveling down here through what's called the Straits of Magellan, where Magellan had passed before. He arrived then on the Pacific coast and continued up along that coast with he only had 1 ship left and 85 men. He managed to capture a Spanish ship that had sailing charts of the Pacific Ocean, and so that enabled him to sail northward in order to find the passage. So the charts that he captured told him what kind of waters there were here, and he was able to keep on going north. He sailed all the way to Alaska, above latitude 48 degrees, before the cold forced him to turn back. And you can see that on the map here. It was then that he found a harbor to repair his ship, and he founded a colony called New Albion. When Drake arrived there, he had only 85 men. He could not return by the Straits of Magellan back through here again, because the Spanish would be waiting for him. And so he decided instead to sail around the world and reach England by that route. So he decided to keep going this way and come through here, all the way around Africa, and back up to England. So he is the second second European ship to sail around the world. Of course, we know the Chinese had done it previous to this. When he arrived at the Moluccas, I'm not sure where that is. I think that's over in this area. He had 65 men left. 20 he left behind to found a colony and to continue looking for the Northwest Passage. September 1580, he returned to England with a vast quantity of gold and silver. And he immediately went to London, where the Queen was to receive him. Now, Prince Philip, or King Philip of Spain, had been putting pressure on Queen Elizabeth to get rid of Drake, because Drake was costing him a lot of money. And Philip had a large navy, so Queen Elizabeth was somewhat afraid of him. He also had a lot of spies in the English court. There were always Spanish there. And so she was, in a lot of ways, in a difficult position of whether to obey him or not. But when Drake arrived back and went to see her, she had received orders from Drake to kill him. And as Drake approached her, she drew out a sword. And Drake as any person would do, knelt before the queen. What was she going to do? She had a sword in her hand. She raised the sword. Let's see. Devin, you be Drake, I'll be Queen Elizabeth. She wasn't all that good looking anyway. Although she didn't have a beard. All right, there's Drake. She raises the sword. What's she going to do? Is she going to lop off his head? No. She touches this shoulder and the other shoulder and says, I knight you. You are now Sir Francis Drake. The service of the Queen. Thank you. So she knighted him. So she rewarded him for his exploits rather than killing him. All right, so this was a fearless act on the part of the Queen, and it enraged King Philip II, who then began to build an even stronger navy so that he could invade England and stop any British colonization of the New World. And that will be called the Spanish Armada. Oh, this is a picture of the Golden Hind, which was Drake's ship. Here's a picture of Drake, and there is a picture of a drawing of Queen Elizabeth IX's Sir Francis Drake. All right, let's look next at that Spanish invasion of England. The planning for the invasion began in 1586 by amassing a huge fleet. So King Philip was building ships, building a lot of ships so that he could invade England. But Drake, knowing of Philip's plans, led 30 ships into Cadiz Harbor in Spain and destroyed thousands of tons of supplies, which delayed Philip's invasion by a year. That was a good thing for England, because if he had invaded when he wanted to, he probably would have been successful. That gave England a year to prepare. And so in 1588, the Spanish Armada entered the English Channel with 130 ships coming in here and 30,000 men. Now, they were supposed to pick up more men here in Netherlands because Spain controlled that area, but because they had been delayed a year, when they went there, the soldiers were not there that were supposed to be there. So they didn't have the extra soldiers they thought they would have. But they're sailing here into the English Channel, and they're going to attack London. As they're coming in here, you can see that this area of water is much more narrow than out in the ocean. And so Francis Drake was able to use smaller ships to maneuver around the large ships of the Armada. Drake used fire ships to break up the formation, because the Spanish, as most navies did at the time, would line up their ships in a row. And so what Drake did is he set small ships on fire and directed them toward the Spanish Armada. So, you know, when you've got a fire ship coming toward you, you've got to move or you're going to catch on fire. And so with the ships of the Armada having to try to move, that messed up their whole formation, and so they weren't able to effectively attack as they desired. Drake was also able to maneuver around the ships and to attack them before their ships could recover and shoot their cannon at Drake. So the Spanish realized that they were losing, and so they couldn't come back the way they had, because Drake had this area populated with his ships. So they decided, we'll go north, up around, and back down this way to Spain, and we'll escape. So they went up through here. They lost ships there in this area, but as they got to this area north of Ireland, a fierce storm hit them and destroyed much of the fleet. Later, the people of England called it a Protestant wind. Destroyed much of the Spanish Armada. This victory secured the future of Protestants in England and enabled England to gain dominance on the seas, and especially North America. The Spanish would never recover from that defeat. And it was not a defeat entirely by Drake, but it was a defeat, the English would say, by God in sinking all those ships. Well, King Philip of Spain responded by putting a price on whom he called El Draque, the dragon, and the modern equivalent of more than $6 million for the capture of public enemy number 1 on the Inquisition list. After 8 more years of scouring the Spanish Main, Drake died of dysentery aboard ship after an unsuccessful attempt to capture San Juan, Puerto Rico. He was dressed in a full suit of armor and buried at sea in a lead coffin. Why? Why in his armor in a lead coffin? What did they expect? That it would sink? It would sink. Now, it's important to be buried at sea that you sink, but usually you just throw the body in and it sinks on its own. But what might they have been afraid of that they're really planning against? If the Spanish found him, they would certainly do things to his body, display it, all those kind of things. So that may have been the reason why. I don't know for sure. But interesting that that's what they did. All right, we will stop there for today. And tomorrow we'll look at the further efforts of England to establish colonies in this new world.